Hi guys, my name's Shue, and today I'm going to teach you guys how to process a black and white image inside Lightroom, but we're going to be using a plugin called Silver Efex Pro, and let me show you why. First of all, before you process your image, you have to understand about when you capture images and how to create something that's rich, dynamic range. I'm not talking about HDR, I'm talking about single frame images that have all the information from blacks to highlights without creating the noise. So if we look at this image here, you see that it looks overexposed. And if we go to this image here, it looks underexposed. Now this was when I walked up on the scene, I took a picture, and this is a JPEG actually, and it shows the proper exposure. The highlights are right and the shadows are light, but it's kind of like dull. It's in the middle. It's not going to give me a really rich file. If you look at the histogram over here, you can see that most of the exposures to the left-hand side is kind of dark because of the fact that there's a lot of green trees in this that are kind of underexposed in the shadow area. In the sky, there's not really any highlight area. So basically, I took another exposure. I wanted to see how dark the shadows could go before I lost all detail, just for my own testing purposes. Then I made this image. Now this image here is exposed to the right. You can easily create a black. If you come over here and just drag down the exposure or the shadow area, you can create a black. Now I'll let you in a little secret here. If you shoot three images, one that's underexposed, one that's exposed properly, and one that's exposed to the right, and you look at the file sizes, you'll see that the one that's exposed to the right is physically a larger file because it has more information. It doesn't have a lot of information when everything's in the shadow area, and the reason why, it doesn't take a lot of data to create black. Okay, so basically you can see that over here we've clipped the red, green, and blue a little bit. Okay, but this is in the color channels. Down here in the gray area, you see this gray part of the histogram, we haven't clipped anything. It stops right here on the right hand side. So that means that all my exposure information is fine, but I did lose a little bit of my blue, and a little bit of red, and a little bit of green in some of the areas of the photo, but just in the highlight area, not the mid-range or the shadow. So if we were to process this, we'd come down here and we'd grab our exposure tool. First we set a black point. We hold down the Alt key, that's the Option key on the Mac, and drag it over and set our black point. Do the same thing with the whites, and we really don't want any whites in this image, so we're going to pull this down till the whites just disappear. We'll grab our highlights and bring them down a little bit, and then we can control our shadow information by this slider. And then the overall exposure, we can control by the exposure. So this is kind of like a brightness control after you got everything else set. We can throw in a little clarity, throw in a little bit of vibrance, okay? And then we could come in and adjust our black and white by clicking here, okay? Now, if you click on auto, it will set it up for you. If you want to get full control, we'll start at 0 on everything. You'll grab this little bug tool here. Let's turn off this shadow warning here because I know that it's underexposed. We're going to fix that if we like. So we're going to grab our little bug tool, and we're going to hover the image, and we'll drag down or up the arrows we want to control. So since the blues are affecting the shadow area as well as the sky, you can see that if we drag that down, we can darken the sky. If we hover this green area of the image where these trees are, we can lighten or darken the green area. Okay, same thing with this browns. I know this was a brown area on the tree, and this will affect the orange and the yellows. We can darken or lighten that area. It looks all fine and dandy. So we come back and grab our basic tool and say we throw a little bit of clarity on it, a little bit more clarity, a little bit of contrast. You can see the image looks kind of blah. I'm not real happy with the way that these adjustments are in Lightroom. And this is the reason why that I use Silver Efex Pro. If you expose to the right and you create this file that has all of the information in it, that very big file, when you go into Color Efex Pro 2 or Silver Efex Pro 2, what it will do is it will allow you to create this really dynamic image. When I say dynamic, one that has darks and lights through the whole file. So let's come down here, and you see if we hover this area with this thing check marked, if we hover, we can see that 0 is black and 10 is white. Now there's nothing really white in the scene. However, if we can see right here in this tree area, we have zone 9. So this is about as high as we want to go in the highlights. So we're going to choose this underexposed by one stop because I overexposed it by one stop in capture. So we can come in and control things that just aren't available for control inside Lightroom. So we can basically pump up the brightness a little bit, and then we can control our highlights. So I can just affect only the highlights. So I bring the highlights down, and I can affect the midtones, okay, the shadow area. Something like this would be fine. And this is called the dynamic brightness. It's kind of like an overall brightness adjustment. We come down here to the contrast. This is kind of like an overall slider. If I want to amplify or take away the whites, amplify the blacks. See, I can start to affect this. And this is what's something called soft contrast. Kind of like it like that. And then structure. This is really cool. This is kind of like an overall structure. We can do this for the highlight area, the midtones, and the shadows. We're basically adding micro contrast in the shadows. And then you have something called fine structure. And you can start to see that everything starts to pop. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now we can come down here and add in a filter. So say if we add in a blue filter, it's going to affect the greens. If we add a red filter, it will affect the blues. Yellow filter, orange filters. Kind of like the way this orange is affecting the image. And you control the strength of this filter, how it affects things. Okay. Now you can see that this image is dramatically different than the image that we processed inside Lightroom. Now that I've got my major adjustments done, I'm going to come and turn these highlights down a little bit more. I might bring this down just a hair and pull that back up. You can see that this is a really dramatic black and white. Let's come down here and look at our ranges now. There's our blacks, and you can see that we have something in just about every zone. 9, and then 10 we don't have. We do have some information in 10, so you can see that in the loop it's showing where the information is. So we have whites all the way through shadow. So we click save. This will load this back into Lightroom, and we can further process this, and I'll show you what you can do. So we'll let this thing load up. So here's our image back inside Lightroom. Now we can do our final touches on this. So we can come in and adjust our exposure a little bit. It's because it looked a little bit bright. Hold down the Alt key. We can see that there's our black point. We see that there's our white point. And we can take these highlights and bring them down a little bit. So I want to darken that sky some. And that might have to make me bring the exposure back up just a hair. Okay. Now I want to emphasize this. Let's pull this back up just a hair. I want to emphasize this part of the mountain. So we're going to use this Radial Filter. So make sure that everything's zeroed out. I'm going to just drag out kind of like an oval shape. I'm going to rotate it around. I'm going to pull it down. I'm going to slide this kind of get it in place. I don't want to create a new one. And now we can control the shadow information around the mountain. Okay, so basically it's everything outside this radial is being affected. We don't want to add too much contrast. We could bring the exposure down just a hair. Maybe the clarity up just a hair. Let's control our highlights. I want to darken this down. Okay, so if you hold down the Control and Alt key, and that's the Command and Option key on the Mac, and you grab this little bug, it'll create a second one. Okay, so slide this kind of back in place, and we're going to invert it. Okay, because this will control what's inside. So we're going to reset this stuff here by double clicking on the little option next to it, and we can control the shadows. We can maybe brighten those up just a hair. Okay, add a little bit more clarity just right there in the mountains. I'm going to brighten this hair, brighten this just a little bit more, and then where it says feather, you see if we take this off, it's just controlling directly inside that oval. I want to feather it more. We slide this guy up just a hair, rotate it around. Okay. I want to make those highlights come out a little bit more. And there we go. I'll close down this. And now you can see that kind of that mountain just pops off. Last thing we'll do is add in a vignette under effects. And that's kind of how I like this image to look. So that's it. Silver FX Pro 2 gives you a lot more control in your black and whites than what you can achieve inside Lightroom. I want to thank you all for taking time to visit today, and until next time, we'll see you soon.